Last week I asked my community to answer a little survey where I asked for each main graphical desktop environment and for Tiling Window Manager users whether they raised or customized things or not. App themes, desktop themes, icons, cursors, and even the desktop layout. That survey got 7,400 answers, and so we're going to take a look at why this data seems to indicate that rising and customization is just not as important on Linux as it once was. Unlike our sponsor, which is really important if you want to stream desktops and apps straight to your web browser. So this video is sponsored by Kasm. They are a great project for performing secure online research or just experimenting with a lot of things. They give you a complete platform to deploy Linux desktops or Windows and even applications in the cloud in as many workspaces as you want, and you can then access all of these desktops and browsers from any web browser. You can self-host all of this, or you can access it through their software as a service subscription. They just released version 1.16, which adds managed egress providers. This new capability gives you an easy and flexible way to attach cloud browsers and web desktop workspaces to OpenVPN or to WireGuard-based VPNs. This allows you to browse the web and to run your desktops and apps in the cloud privately and anonymously. So the Kasm Workspaces Community Edition can be self-hosted, so you can run everything in your own personal infrastructure, or they have a subscription service, a software as a service subscription that lets you run using their cloud. All the links are, as usual, in the description of the video. So, as usual, a quick rundown of what the survey actually was. I shared it on the channel's community page, I shared it on Mastodon, which is the only social network account I really use, and I also mentioned it at the beginning of the previous Linux news video. If you don't want to miss these surveys when I do them, do check out the community feed of the channel, do check out my Mastodon account, and if you don't use Mastodon, at least subscribe to the channel. I always mention these surveys in at least one video before the survey goes live. So the survey got 7,400 answers. It's a bit less than the previous surveys I ran, but it's still a lot. And as usual, these are answers from my community, so there is an inherent bias towards Linux desktop users who probably prefer simple, easy desktops. It is, of course, not representative of the entire Linux desktop users community, which is obviously much larger than 7,400 answers and not fully represented by my personal audience. So first I asked which desktop or graphical environment people used, and here we have the "it's my community" bias in plain sight. We have 32.5% GNOME users, 38.3% KDE users, and 13.8% Tiling Window Managers. Cinnamon was only 8.7%, and then we had XFCE at 3.7%, and the other ones just really did not matter. Mate, Budgie got under a percentage point, and then we had other desktops at 2%. Which makes me wonder, which desktop did I forget that added up is higher than Mate or Budgie? I'm not entirely sure, so let me know in the comments. Now, of course, what this specifically tells us is that, yes, the audience for my channel tends to prefer simple, unified, easy to use, easy to learn graphical experiences, which is why GNOME and KDE are really predominant here. I'm sure if you had asked the exact same questions on another YouTuber's community, you would have gone a lot more Tiling Window Manager users, maybe a lot more KDE users, and a lot less GNOME. It's, of course, the bias for my specific community. So let's start with the big boy here, KDE, and generally KDE users seems to mostly not really change the look of their desktop. 53.4% said they used Breeze, the default application theme for KDE. That's more than half. And if you add up this with the people who use the default theme that their distribution provides, that's more than 60% who do not change stuff from the default. Almost 32% change the application theme to something else, but only 7.6% change it using another theme engine, like for example using Quantum, which lets you install more stuff. Only 40.5% of KDE users change their icon theme. 51% default to Breeze, and 8.5% just do not change stuff from what their distribution provides. Same goes for the Plasma theme. You only have 40.4% of people changing that Plasma theme, so that's the theme for the panel, the theme for the various widgets that you have. 51% default to Breeze, and 8.6% only rely on what their distribution provides if it was not the Breeze default theme. And for mouse cursors, 60% of people use the default Breeze cursors, and 8% on top of that keep the default that their distro provides. So only 31.6% of people change their cursors for their mouse. So yeah, more than half say that they just don't really tweak KDE at all. Except that's not true, because I also asked people if they changed the layout of the KDE desktop, as in the place of the panels, the widgets inside the panels, and things like that. And here, answers are really different. Yeah, only 12% of people use the default KDE panel without any changes. 59% change a few things on the default, a few widgets, a few panel settings. About 27% change the entire KDE layout, meaning they remove the default panel and they create their own stuff where they want to place it with the widgets that they like. And only 2.2% replace the entire KDE panel with another solution, like for example another dock like Latte Dock. And this echoes my experience perfectly. I run KDE as my default desktop, and I run it on an ultra-wide, meaning the default panel just doesn't really work for me. It was way too long, so I just centered it, did what was needed so everything looked right. I removed the widgets that I didn't use, and I switched that panel to dodging windows when windows are trying to overhang over that panel. That's it. Everything else is the Breeze theme, and I did not change anything apart from the wallpaper. So I guess I'm the basic KDE user, much like most people who answered the survey. We don't really change the visuals, we really do change the layout of the desktop. Now, when we're talking about GNOME, the lack of customization is even stronger. 61.9% of people do not change the default GNOME theme over Adwaita, which is the default one used by literally every libadwaita app. That's probably even stronger now that GNOME has accent colors, meaning if you didn't like blue, you can put up anything you want instead. This proportion goes up to 76.5% if you also add in the people who use the default theme that their distro provides, for example, the orange theme in Ubuntu. As per icons, 54.7% of people use the default, the bog standard GNOME Adwaita theme, and that proportion goes up to about 70% when you take a look at people who also don't change things over what their distro provides. So it's only about 30%, a bit less than 30%, changing the icon themes, which is understandable. It's higher than the people changing the GTK theme, because changing the icons is much easier. You don't have any hoops to jump through, you just install GNOME tweaks and you change them. For the GNOME shell, 62% don't change it over Adwaita, 15% on top of that don't change it over what the distro provides, so it only leaves 22% of people changing that GNOME shell theme, for example using something like GNOME tweaks. And mouse cursor, nobody cares. That's about 78-79% of people not changing it over the default, either Adwaita or the cursor that the distro provides. It's only 20% of people who bother changing it to something else. Again, understandable. The mouse cursor have gone a long way. They look decent, they're nice. Why would you change them unless you really want a specific aesthetic? But here again, what people really change inside of GNOME is the desktop itself, the layout. Everyone uses extensions in GNOME. Just look at that. 80% of people add extensions on top of GNOME or on top of what their distro provides. 80% use something more than what the distro or what vanilla GNOME provides. Only 10% of people use vanilla GNOME, so for example close to what Fedora provides or what you would install in Arch if you install GNOME by default. And 9% of people use the GNOME desktop that their distro provides with the extensions they had, so that can be very minimal with like the 2 extensions Ubuntu provides, the 2 or 3 extensions, or it can be a lot like a Zorin OS level of customization. But this is an important indication to the GNOME developers, and this confirms what they had gathered in terms of data with their optional telemetry tool that you had to install to actually report any data if you wanted to use that. People do not use vanilla GNOME. People always add, at the very least, one extension. They already know this. They already know this data. They have the capabilities to know which is the most downloaded and installed extension on gnomeextensions.org. So please, GNOME developers, add that in. If 80% of your users, or whatever else the real number is in a more representative part of the entire GNOME user base is, if at least 80% of people add something on top of your desktop, you probably should have it by default, or at the very least as an option that you can enable instead of forcing people to rely on extensions, which are neither fully official nor fully supported and break regularly with updates to the GNOME desktop. So this really should tell something to the GNOME developers. You have at least one feature that's missing and that you should add in there. If you want to bet what that is, I'm willing to bet it is system tray icons. Now, to provide a lot of contrast, we're going to talk about independent tiling window managers. And so I asked people whether they changed the application theme of their system when they were running a window manager. And 84% of people do change the theme to something that they installed, meaning that if they use GTK apps, they changed that GTK theme from the default Advaita. If they use KDE apps, they removed Breeze and use something else. Only 15% keep the default theme. Same story with icons. 64.3% of people changed to an icon theme that they installed themselves. Only 35.7% of people do keep what was provided. Only tiling window manager users care about cursor themes, apparently. About 58% of them do change the mouse cursors to something they installed themselves, and only 42.1% keep the default one. So it's the complete opposite of other major desktops. Where things get very interesting is the desktop layout. So adding a new panel using the default panel provided by your window manager. Because here, most people use an entirely different panel than the default that was provided with their tiling window manager. Presumably, this answer also includes people using tiling window managers that don't provide a default panel, meaning you do have to add something if you want to have at least some system indicators, system tray, a clock. Some window managers don't have default panels, most of them do, and most people seem to change that and not use the default at all. Now, for people who use the default panel, there's 6% of people keeping the default one box standard without any changes. You've got 18.7% keeping the default and changing a few things, and 24.8% completely customizing the default panel. So basically, you've got a nice split in the middle. You've got half of the people using tiling window managers who say, you know what, the default panel sucks, or there's no default panel, I'm gonna install something better. And the other half is like, this one is okay, but I'm mostly going to change things up. And that's totally understandable if you compare it with something like the results we got in GNOME. If you want to use something as customizable and that requires muscle memory, relearning a few things, you're willing to go the route of the tiling window manager over something that is already set up for you and prepackaged, you're probably also doing that to customize every part of the experience. And this includes the themes, the icons, the cursors, and the entire layout. So obviously, tiling window manager users are more susceptible to change things. And so if the question is Linux customization dead or is Rising dead? Well, it's not dead, but it's really not dead for tiling window manager users who are basically keeping the spirit of Compiz alive after a bunch of years. They're basically the risers, and people using like KDE or GNOME are not all that into customization, at least compared to tiling window manager users. Now, if we look at Cinnamon, which is a desktop who is mostly provided by Linux Mint and mostly geared towards Linux beginners, or at least people transitioning to Linux, because it is the desktop that has the most graphical tools out there to replicate the graphical tools you might have been used to using Windows. Well, Cinnamon users seem to like customization a bit more than users of other desktops. Only 45% of people keep the default Cinnamon theme or the default Linux Mint theme. I kinda had to merge those two because most people using Cinnamon use it on Linux Mint. 30.2% of people changed the GTK theme in Cinnamon to one that is pre-installed. I added that option to cover all the variants of the themes that Linux Mint ships. And only 24% of people changed the GTK theme to something that they installed themselves. As per icons, 41.1% used the default Cinnamon icon theme or the Mint icon theme, 32.6% used something that was pre-installed by their distro, so presumably one of the themes Linux Mint ships, and 26% of people installed their own. So a lot more customization here than on other desktops. Now the Cinnamon theme, the theme for the panel of Cinnamon and the various elements that appear when you click on a calendar or something, again, people use the default Cinnamon theme at 46%, but 29% use something else that was pre-installed, and 24.6% of people change something to one they installed themselves. So more changing the default than keeping it. No one cares about mouse cursors on Cinnamon either. 78% of people use what was provided and only 22% change it to something else. As per the Cinnamon desktop layout, most people change a few things here. 59% of people change some panel settings, adding a few widgets, reordering stuff. So less than a quarter of Cinnamon users seem to use the default Cinnamon desktop without any change, and 16.8% of people change the entire layout. So they add other panels, they remove the default ones, and they do whatever the hell they want in their desktop. So Cinnamon seems like more of a middle of the road between KDE and GNOME and something like a tiling window manager. We always assume Cinnamon is a desktop environment geared towards users, new users, beginners. But that's probably because it's shipped by Linux Mint, which is very often recommended to new users. The thing is, a lot of people who are expert at Linux, really adept at using the system, also prefer using Linux Mint because it's really stable and it has a lot of tools and it doesn't go the you can't really customize things route that GNOME has, but it's also not overloaded with options like KDE. And so, yeah, Cinnamon is a middle of the road. It is more customized by users than GNOME or KDE, but it is also generally more accessible than some of these desktops, especially in the realm of customization, because GTK themes are easy to find, easy to come by, and also very easy to change inside of Mint, because they do keep that little settings window that lets you change all of those themes. You don't have to install something else to make that work. Now, XFCE is the realm of customization. 56% of users change the GTK theme and don't use the default, which is represented by those two ones, people using Greybird, the default one, and people using a default theme that is not Greybird that their distro provided. People also change icons a lot more than in GNOME and KDE. 57% of people do that, and 58% of people use the default cursor. So even there, no one really cares about mouse cursor themes. Most people just want to keep that. But here again, a lot of people change a bunch of stuff in the default XFCE desktop. Only 10% keep the default XFCE without any change. 42.9% change the entire layout of the XFCE desktop, adding other panels, removing the default one, and 46.9% change a few things, reordering and changing some settings. So mostly people don't just use the box standard XFCE. As for Budgie, most people keep the default theme, but there's still a sizable proportion of people that change the theme to something else. It's not half and half, but it's still a lot of people. 66% of people use the default Budgie icon theme provided by their distro. Only a third of people change it to something else, which is strange because that's, I think, the least amount of people who change the default icon theme in desktops, so pretty interesting. As per the icons, it's 2/3 of respondents who do not change the icon theme from what was provided by their distro, only a third do. No one cares about cursor themes, again, about 80% of people don't change them. And as per the Budgie desktop layout, a full-on quarter of people just don't change anything from the default top panel, the Raven panel that pops up from the right, and the little dock at the bottom. People just don't change that. 12.5% of people change the entire layout, and 62.5% people change some panel settings, adding a few widgets, reordering things, so minimal customization, but still changing a few things. So Budgie seems to be in the same ballpark as Linux Mint. Mostly it's a desktop used maybe by people who want a bit more changes and a bit more control over their desktop rather than using GNOME, but they don't want to go all the way to the KDE levels of customization, which, interestingly, most people don't really take advantage of all that much. As per Mate, most people seem to change the GTK theme. It's almost 2/3 of respondents, which I can understand because the default one is pretty old. 56% of people change the icons and 44% keep the default Mate icon theme. 66% of people don't care about cursors, 2/3, 1/3 for people who do change them. And only 18% of people keep the default Mate layout without any changes, so the default GNOME 2 layout basically. 52% of people change a few things, likely adding a few widgets, reordering things, changing how the menu works maybe. And 30% of people change the entire layout, changing everything from the ground up. Mate really does not seem to have a lot of users in my community, and so these results are not that representative, probably because it's very few answers. But yeah, Mate is a desktop that you choose because you really liked the GNOME 2 desktop, so you don't change things all that much apart from the visual side of things, which is absolutely dated, and so I'm not surprised that people would want to customize that a lot. And finally, we have the other desktops, which I'm not exactly sure what it represents, honestly. It might be stuff like LXQt, LXDE, Sugar, or Enlightenment, or stuff like that. And for those 147 answers, people seem to mostly keep the default. 57% don't really customize things all that much in terms of theme. 68% keep the default icon theme as well. 76% of people don't really change the cursor theme either. But here again, most people do take the opportunity to change various layouts, either changing it entirely, that's about a quarter, and more than half change a few things here and there. Of course, this was a grab bag, and depending on the desktop itself that people are using, it might provide a lot of options to tweak things, or virtually no options at all, so this is not super representative. But do tell me in the comments, which desktop environments represent all agglomerated together 2% of those responses, more than Mate, more than Budgie, and more than Mate and Budgie combined. Because I must have missed one big one, but I really did not think that LXDE or LXQt had that many users. So you let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Anyway, what we can conclude on this is that, first, people don't customize their desktops look and feel all that much. It's generally more than half of the people who answered who just keep the bog standard default. And if you add up keeping the default that your distro provides, it's generally about at least 2/3 of people not changing anything. But people always take the opportunity to change the layout. Whether you're on KDE, on a tiling window manager, on Mate, on Budgie, on GNOME even with extensions, people do not keep the default layout most of the time. They change things, even if it's more complex, like using GNOME extensions that aren't really supported through updates and break from time to time. So this really tells us that the flexibility of Linux isn't really in the graphical appearance, although a lot of people still do take advantage of that. It's really in how you can make your system work exactly like you want. And that's probably the only system that gives you that flexibility. Changing the Windows default start menu or taskbar is extremely hard without using a third-party tool that generally isn't super trustworthy. And on macOS you can't even change anything, so it's terrible. So Linux is the only real desktop operating system that gives you all of that flexibility baked in, and that's really what people seem to be interested in. The graphical customizations are nice to have, but not that many people take advantage of it, at least not compared to how many people I thought would want to customize everything. Anyway, this will conclude this little survey, so please, GNOME developers, if you're watching, do find out which extension people are adding all the time and add that one as an option, because clearly that's what people want. And in the meantime, thank you all for listening. I leave you on this message from our sponsor. It's Tuxedo Computers. You know about them by now. They make laptops and desktops that ship with Linux pre-installed. I only use their devices these days. All of these videos are recorded, written, edited, published. I read your comments on there. I game on there. I only use one of their laptops and one of their desktops. One for gaming and the other one for all my work and also for teaching my students every Friday morning. They're really solid. They have a big range of computers that should provide something for every price range and for every need. I left a link to them in the description of the video. Do check them out if you want a computer that runs perfectly with Linux and if you want to give your money to a company that actively contributes to Linux as well. So thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't hesitate to click all the usual YouTube buttons, it really helps. And don't hesitate to subscribe if you don't want to miss the next little poll that we'll do on the channel. In the meantime, thank you all for watching. No news video this week because, well, I'm getting my wisdom teeth removed. I already told you that in the previous one, so don't expect a video on Saturday, but I'll see you next week. Bye!